Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a webinar hosted by CISQ, Automated Function Point Sizing in an Agile and DevOps World. My name is Tracy Berardi. I'm Program Manager of CISQ, and I'm joined by Dave Norton, Executive Director of CISQ, who will deliver the presentation. For those of you who may not know CISQ, we are the Consortium for Information and Software Quality, a nonprofit IT leadership group co-founded by the OMG, a standards body, and the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University to develop standards for automating software quality measurement. Now, the specification for automated function points was developed by an international team of CISQ members led by IFPUG function point expert David Herron, who's co-author of Function Point Analysis with David Garmis, with whom he founded the David Consulting Group. And we strove to define the AFP standard as close to IFPUG function point counting rules as possible, while removing ambiguity in the rules so that AFP could be automated. And AFP has now been approved by OMG and ISO, and is now an international standard ISO 19515. So today, Dave's going to talk about AFP in the context of Agile development at DevOps. And before we get started, I'd like to mention that we'll share a copy of the slides after the presentation today. We post them to our website along with a recording of the webinar. And a CISQ one-pager overview is available now in the Handouts tab. And we're going to save some time at the end of the presentation for questions. There's going to be some polling throughout, but feel free to enter your questions at any time, and I'll be moderating that box. And if there's quick questions that can be inserted in between, we'll address those. But if not, we'll have some time at the end. David, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks, Tracy, and thanks everybody for joining me here. I'm actually sat on a boat on the Thames at the moment. I live in a barge, which is quite nice. And I'm very excited to talk about this subject because this is a subject which is, to be honest, a bit of an odd one for me. And the reason why is my history with function points goes back 25 years. And my master's project was on function point accounting analysis in real-time systems. And I have to be honest and say it was not the most fun project to do. It was quite dry, quite a heavy subject. And in the UK, we have a saying that, Marmite, you either love it or hate it. And I kind of went on the side of hate it, to be honest, because it was, I was a developer and I come from the battle space world, and now I'm doing this thing called function points. But I grew to love it. The reason being was during the project, I started to realize questions I've been asking as an engineer for many, many years in terms of things like how much technical debt did we have in the organization? What was our real lead time? How productive really were we as an organization? It allowed me to start thinking about those questions, and it allowed me to start thinking about those questions in a consistent way. So many years on, I got involved. I ran the function point counting group for companies like DHL, got involved with function point counting with outsourcers, and then I joined Gartner. Now, when I joined Gartner, I joined as one of the model-driven guys, but also on the Agile side, because I was on the pilot project for UK DSDM Agile in Defence back in '96. So I waterfall background, crossed into Agile, hated it for 18 months, and then kind of got to love it again. So I've had this relationship with function points and this relationship with Agile for many, many years. And the thing I think is important today is this question around how do we size, how do we look at productivity in an Agile and DevOps world is a really, really hot topic. Before I joined CISQ, in the last 2 years at Gartner, and actually I quickly checked this before I started today, the last 2 years at Gartner, the question of sizing in an Agile and DevOps world came up 4 times a week for me. So it was about 20% of the questions I had, and that was just me. There were lots of other analysts who were doing this, getting the same sorts of questions. So it's a hot topic. Now, I'd like to get to know each other before we all start getting into this. So I'm going to ask a first poll question. Is your organization struggling with sizing? So that's the first question. So if I jumped ahead there, so if I just flash that up, so you should see that now. Do you see that, guys?
Yep.
So if you could all quickly fill that in, it would help us as we navigate through. And I can see how many people have voted. So I can see that we've got about 60% to still focus in, 10% are already asleep. Oh, we're doing well. We're doing well. Okay. And 79% we've hit analysis paralysis. So I'm going to stop it there. Okay, so let's close that poll and quickly share results. So, yeah, not surprising there that people are struggling. You know, nearly 70% of people are struggling to actually size within their organization. Now, for the remainder, the 33% that sorry, 30% roughly that said no, either they didn't vote or are we interested to see where they're coming from? Are they coming from a position of a team level or an enterprise level? But it's fair to say it's a common problem. So let's get back to the next question for you. You're at this presentation now, and you know we're talking about a size-based approach. We know 70% of us are struggling to size. So I'm interested how many people are thinking about using a standard method over the next 6 months, 12 months, or actually currently have no plans. So if you're new to this and you haven't really thought about it, select no plans. I'll be very interested to see how many people actually are doing this already, because I know some of our CISQ members and people we deal with are. So we'll just give that a little bit more time, and then we'll get into the presentation proper. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll there because we've got about 70% people vote. So there's actually quite a healthy measure there, 42%. You currently using automated sizing standards. Now, I suspect there is a skewed result there because I think many of the people that are on the line are already CISQ members. So I'm actually more interested in that within the 6 months and 12 months, because that shows that there is, again, over 30% of the people on the call have thought about this and decided that they need to think about having a standard. We've got 25% of people that say no plans at the moment, and again, that could be depending on the viewpoint of that individual within their organization. So let me close up that poll and go back to the slides. So hopefully you can see there's a pig and a chicken joke. Now, this joke has been in the Agile community for many, many years. And, it's this standard joke, pig and a chicken open in a restaurant. The pig says, what should we call it? And the chicken says, how about ham and eggs? And the pig says, well, hang on a moment there. I'm committed, you're involved. Now, the idea behind the joke is the team is the pigs, and they're the ones actually bringing home the bacon. The chickens are everybody outside. They can influence, they can talk, but it's the pigs that really make the major decisions. It's a bad joke. It always was a bad joke. But the trouble is, more worryingly, it doesn't actually reflect the reality of the world. The reality is the chickens provide the funding. They are the major report to the shareholders. They own the strategy. The chickens can fire their pigs, or they can go to an organization, a different supplier. So we've got to recognize that in the enterprise context, it doesn't always work the way we would like from the agile world. And this is now causing major issues. This is why we get so much interest in this problem of how can we size and then look at that size measurement in terms of productivity and quality in this agile context. And we're getting this debate now. I was actually on a forum recently where it was struggling to get off, well, can't they just trust us? So I said, if you walk into a board meeting and ask for $60 million and then just say, trust me, that's a career limiting move. So the reality is we have to think about sizing and looking at productivity and the related metrics when we're dealing with these much more complex and larger programs and there's bigger risk involved. So I think Agile and DevOps is going through its teenage angst years. There is some growing up to do. But also on the management side of things, from the chicken side, there does need to be movement in terms of their attitude and their behavior. There has to be an understanding that the way we use metrics in the past, especially productivity and sizing metrics, must not be repeated in an Agile and DevOps world. If those metrics are used as a management stick, then Agile quite rightly won't buy into it. Teams won't want to be involved. So there needs to be a meeting of minds and a bit of compromise here on both sides. So this is the uncomfortable truth. All of us look at productivity and size every single day. You walk into a coffee shop and there's a queue. Subconsciously or consciously, you're looking at that barista. You're looking at how quickly that individual is working, and you're making a quick estimate of their productivity, and you're making an estimate of the size of the queue. And you're deciding whether you want to stay in that queue or not. You order a taxi, you order an Uber. I guarantee you'll think about, or you'll ask, when are you going to be here? And when you get to the taxi, you ask, how long before we get there? And if you're having any building work done, a brick wall is a good example. Brickies tell you how many bricks they lay per hour. It's a standard question on a building site. So if we live in a world where we all think about how big is that queue, how long is that taxi journey, how many walls or big bricks can that builder do if they're building my house, how long will it take? Can we really be exempt when we're dealing with agile teams? If I'm a developer in an agile team, and I have been a developer in an agile team, can I really turn around and say, well, I can't give you the same sorts of information that you might ask in your daily life, and you certainly want to ask from a management perspective or a stakeholder perspective. So let's get into what we do at the moment in terms of this question with an Agile. So Agile uses a wide band Delphi technique, story sizing. The story sizing is very popular. It's one of my favorite ways of sizing. It's human nature actually is better at sizing relatively than it is from an absolute perspective. So story points and story-based sizing works very, very well for individual teams. What about when you've got multiple teams involved? So things like an agile release train from SAFe, or if you're doing Scrum or Scrums, this is where it starts to get complicated. Some organizations, you find the product owner, the product manager will say, I don't care. I'm lucky that my stakeholders are very focused on the end deliverables and don't really ask me too many awkward questions about our overall productivity. So if you're in that situation, you're one of the lucky ones. But most of us are not. Most organizations I've dealt with in my career start to ask these awkward questions about how productive are all those teams that we're spending thousands of dollars on, or with our suppliers. And what about when you start to get to distributed teams? So many years ago, I worked in an organization that had spun up agile teams in Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, India, North America, and Prague in the Czech Republic. And when things got tight, money-wise, there was a big decision to be made about which centers we might have to reduce or actually close completely. And there was a huge question mark about their productivity because we had gone over to Scrum in most of those teams. And that caused a major panic because we suddenly realized this decision could be made more on a subjective basis rather than on an objective basis about actually who was delivering the best quality at the highest rate. And it gets worse when you're dealing with third parties. Are the third parties really giving you the productivity you expected? Are they giving you productivity that's up to the industry standard? So again, this is something that I got involved with both at Gartner and beforehand, especially with DevOps teams, because a lot of outsourcers now, a lot of SIs are using a software factory model or combined with DevOps or pure DevOps models. And there is this question mark of, okay, we could be, we may be using DevOps and the Agile practices, but is it really value for money? And there are bigger questions as well. I want to know not how much are they delivering to me, but are they delivering it with low levels of technical depth? Because one question that I see that we need to really look at is the total cost of ownership. Agile is very good and DevOps is very good at delivering features, but a poorly delivered system will cost you 4 to 7 times more in the first 2 years in terms of total cost of ownership. And to answer that question, we need common datums, and this is where we get back into the sizing issue. So here's the problem space that we're having to deal with. And increasingly, the chickens are becoming more senior, becoming more aggressive about asking the questions, and putting more pressure on the development teams and their suppliers to find an answer for this. Now, the surprising one, when I speak to Agile teams, I said, but Dave, we're delivering value to the customer. It's our first principle about Agile, about delivering value to customer. And the customer doesn't care about this sizing stuff, this productivity stuff. Well, actually, the customer does. Whether that software is on an iPhone or it's enterprise software, I guarantee they raise an eyebrow. They will walk away if it costs too much. And without understanding the sizing question, it's very difficult to gauge whether we're actually delivering those features at a reasonable price point or whether it's costing too much for the organization, especially when you're dealing with internal customers. So it's not just management we need to be concerned about. The sizing question has a direct impact on our end customers in terms of the productivity issues and cost issues. So what are people doing? We're fudging it. So probably about 8 years ago, I actually wrote a paper, and I'm going to put my hand up here and say, I wish I had never written this paper. It told Agile teams how to fudge the sizing question. And these were some of the things that I talked about, having standard number of hours for story point, which basically means you end up using ideal days. You're not using story points anymore, you're using ideal days. And one example is teams looking at the tasks associated with a story point and tracking the activity effort per task. The problem with that is that can end up with unnecessary breakdown to a task level to get a metric. So the fudging approach, my favorite one is just make it up, because I've worked in organizations where we've done that, is what's happening in many organizations today at the enterprise level. The teams are trying to kind of answer the question and keep management off their back. Now, this is a new trend. In about the last 18 months, I've been involved with 3 organizations that are effectively reinventing function points under another guise. So I can think of a number of telcos, for example, where they have developed a sizing-based standard internally on story points. When I've reviewed the standard, what I've seen is they are saying to teams, you will assess the number of queries that are involved in that system. You will look at the size of external integration in terms of databases and record complexity and internal record complexity. Effectively, they're reinventing the work that was done in 1978 by Albrecht around function points. So why is this happening? Because they have to answer this question. But why won't they accept function points? Why won't they look at function points afresh? So we're going to get into that in a moment about why that is why that's not the case in many organizations. And this is why. If you speak to teams, if you actually not just teams, I've spoken to many managers, quite senior managers, about the use of function points. And this is what they think. Old, ugly, it's an evil thing, you know, like say it might even eat your children. But more they say, oh, it leads to over documentation. It's a waterfall approach. And this one is probably the most important one. It's a management tool of control. It was used by managers to say, hey, your team is less productive than the other team. Why? Without really understanding that a team that appears less productive, you know, may only do 12 function points per staff month, is actually dealing with higher levels of technical debt in that legacy code, is actually under-resourced, is dealing in a more complex environment, a more finicky customer. We all know the reasons why productivity differs, but quite often people don't really accept those differences. So this is the one that I hear the most when I chat to people about the use of function points, is they say, Dave, it's a tool for management, by management, to control us. So can we have our cake and eat it? Is there a way of sizing consistently that would allow us then to do measurements around productivity against the standard size and quality measurements against the standard size that doesn't get in the way of the teams, that doesn't cause over documentation, that is not waterfall? Well, I think the answer is yes. We started many years ago with the CISQ automated function points, and also there's the CISQ enhanced function points as well, which were published via the OMG. And now we have our ISO standard 19515. And I'd like to give a shout out to Bill Curtis here, because Bill has been really instrumental in pushing this through as well as many others. And this standard allows us to think about sizing in an automated way. And I think we can all agree, whether you like function points or not, we can all agree we're moving to highly automated development environments. So a question comes up, can you really size function points from the code? Now, I've had this debate many times with experts about function points. It was one of the things that came up during my master's project at Philips R&D, because Philips, we just got to level 5 CMI, and we wanted to use automated, well, a very early version of automated function points. The answer is you can size function points from the code if you have the empirical data, and if you can develop an algorithm that's robust against a wide variation of coding styles and code languages. And we were in a very good position to have individuals that had that information, that had that data, had that knowledge to help identify patterns, code patterns that we could relate back to what would have been the rets and debts and logical files and the queries across the boundary if we had coded from a document-centric approach. So this is not simply backfiring. There's an approach in function points called backfiring, which is notoriously bad. 84 lines of Java equals one function point, 124 lines of C equals one function point. That backfiring method is not what we're talking about here. This is not simply adding up lines of code and saying that equals so many function points. There is a lot of intelligence behind this in looking at how the code is put together, looking at the code structure, looking at the code patterns that is then used to define that function points. So I want to expel that myth. We're not simply backfiring from lines of code. So now we're in a situation that a team if they wanted to, could still be using story points, but we can measure the actual function points they've shipped from the code base. You can measure the amount of code they've developed versus the amount of code they've actually shipped. And I've got a client in Northern Ireland that actually does that, where the team measures the amount of code developed per sprint. And they then look at how much of that code was refactored in terms of automated function points and how much of that code was actually shipped at the end of the sprint, or in some cases released as ghost code. So we can have our cake and eat it. We can be in a situation that the automated function points can be collected fairly and consistently. And if the teams want to, they can use the automated function points as part of the sizing and estimation process, or if they want to, they can leave it transparently in the background and still use their story points. So you can have a team, I'll give you one example, where the team was using tiger points. That sounds a little bit strange, but what they had decided to do was they used endangered species. So one team was using tiger points, another team was using panda points. The reason being, you can't compare tigers and pandas. They had done this deliberately to get management to understand, saying to the team, hey, team A is doing 25 story points and team B is doing 40. They were getting fed up with that. So they said, right, well, team A, we use tiger points. Team B, they're using panda points. Boss, you can't compare tigers and pandas. But also now they're in a situation that underneath the hood at the code level, there is a consistent approach where they can actually say, team A, their tiger point equals 3 function points. Team B, their panda points actually equals 2.5 function points or 2 function points. And the teams can use that if they want to, or they can, to a certain extent, ignore it. So you can have relative sizing combined with absolute function point based sizing from the code. And this becomes very important when you start to think about Scrum or Scrums, Agile release trains, because now we can start to aggregate up that sizing data, and we can start to look at the bigger questions of how productive is a particular Agile release train or solutions trains? How productive are we at a portfolio level? And you could do lots of other things here as well. Because we have this metric now, I can start to ask and see questions of what percentage of the portfolio in terms of automated function points is high risk? What's the overall technical debt levels or percentages? What's the average cost per function point from my supplier from that release train or from that software factory? Pardon me. So it's important that the automated function points are built into the DevOps toolchain. If this becomes a process where we only do it once every 4 months, or when there's an issue, we're not bringing sizing and measurement further forward. This needs to be something that is done just the way I do continuous integration every day, or certainly 2 or 3 times a sprint. And I would look at that information when I'm cutting my code. I would look at that information when I'm doing release. I would look at that information from an operations monitoring perspective. How many function points, automated function points, are we actually monitoring? How many automated function points are we updating or configuring? So it's useful information not just for development, it's also useful information on the operations side as well. So one of my clients, what they do, sorry, dropping into Gartner world there, one organization, they measure the amount of automated function points they have running within their cloud environment and the ratio of support staff and DevOps staff who are involved in the monitoring and configuration. So it varies from 1 FTE for every 700 function points, automated function points, to a range of 1 FTE up to about 2,500. What's the difference? The lower figure, 1 per every 700, is legacy systems rehosted in the cloud environment. The 2,500 figure is a brand new system, low levels of technical debt. That information is absolutely crucial for them as a global organization, so they can answer the question, how much are we really spending on maintenance on the operation side? Bearing in mind, the CapEx ratio in most organizations is only 8 to 16% of a product of a system is CapEx. The remainder is spent in OpEx. Now, when we deal with sizing, whether it's automatic function points or whether it's classic function points or cosmic or whatever it might be, we tend to naturally think about the sizing measure in a development side, more on the CapEx side. It would be good practice to start thinking about it more on the OpEx side as well, in terms of how that sizing measure can help us on the support, maintenance and configuration and the through life support. So time for another question, another polling question here, if I can get this working. Oops. Okay, so next question. So who is using function points with their suppliers? Hopefully you can see that. Tracy, can you see that poll?
Yep. There we go.
Okay, so this is, are you using standard function points with your supplier today? Okay, right. So there we go. No real surprise there. The data I have is around about 35% of organizations are using some formal sizing metric with their suppliers. Again, we might have some skewed results here because of the audience, but what it's really telling us is, over half of organizations do not use, either feel it's not applicable or they're not using it. Again, they're not applicable, I think, depends on your viewpoint in the organization. If an organization says, well, Dave, we don't do any outsourcing, then I think we need to step back, because one of the questions I've got recently is about SaaS providers. There's a very large SaaS organization that I won't name, where I've had interactions with a number of their customers, and their customers are in the financial world, and they have had to go and ask that supplier, almost tell that supplier, we need information now for the regulator on the amount of technical debt you are delivering in the SaaS system. Now, the answer, you might say, well, there shouldn't be any technical debt, but reality is there's always technical debt. They're also asking, in that SaaS product, how much functionality has been released over the last six to 12 months, and again, how much technical debt, and also the number of cyber incidents per unit of size of release. Now, the SaaS provider has said no in both cases. We're not going to provide you that information. The two end user organizations I'm dealing with said, Dave, the problem they face is they've gone back to the regulator, and the regulator said, well, that's not acceptable. That SaaS product is critical for your business. It's appeared on a number of cyber incidents in the last 2 years. You need to start getting that information. So I think what we're going to find is this issue is going to be bigger than simply we cut code or somebody else's cuts code. We now need to think about how this information may be used by SaaS providers as well, and standard package providers. Okay, so I go back to the slides. So dealing with suppliers. When I first used function points with outsourcers, one of the things I learned very quickly was they can be gamed, and automatic function points are harder to game, but not impossible. So they could be gamed like anything. So you need to make sure you're actually validating the suppliers against the AFP and the ISO standard. Now, this is one of the advantages of using the standard, because you can then say to that supplier, we will periodically look at the way you provide sizing information and related productivity information and what else you relate to that sizing information against the standard. So one of the things that I used to do, I mean, the last time I did this, I went out to 15 organizations in India. We told them they had to give us each 3 projects, and we were going to look at how those projects were sized and how that information was provided to the organizations that we were dealing with. We also said we would randomly pick one project of our choice within the week we turned up. Now, of the 15, about 6 or 7 were Agile, and we said we were going to walk around and pick some Scrum teams and then ask to see how they're sizing. So we made sure that the suppliers were being honest and upfront. Now, what's interesting is many suppliers, if you say we're using a standard to size against, and if they believe that standard is fair, they're actually quite open to do this. The other thing is, if a supplier is good, if they're good at Agile and DevOps and they've got a good delivery rate, this is a way they can use to show that. So you actually get occasionally suppliers who are more than happy to do this, because this is the way they can say, hey, Dave, look, we are really good. We deliver a very low technical debt. We don't have many quality issues, and we can show you that by using ratios or percentage of technical debt per AFP sized ISO standard function points. It's important that your vendor management community really understands how to use AFP as well, because if the vendor management community doesn't understand how to size or what AFP is about, then they're missing an opportunity to build it into contract language, to monitor vendors by it, and to benchmark. Now, bearing in mind, AFP is based on IFPUG. It's mapped back to the original function point standards. So you can go to a benchmarking organization and you can compare AFP to that benchmarking organization's data, even if that data has been collected in a more traditional way. So you've still got that ability to tap into what is the world's biggest collection of benchmarking data, which is all based on function points, going back to 82, 83 was the first major benchmark.
Hey Dave, it's Tracy. Just real quick, we still have the poll up. I wasn't sure if you jumped back to your slides.
Sorry, I will see what's happened here. Okay. We show results, and I will hide the results. So you should be seeing the slides. Have you seen the slides?
Actually, it's still stuck on the poll. Let me see if I can close that. And I'm stuck on the poll.
So let me go back in. Sharing. So let's see what's happening here. So it's still saying sharing poll for some reason. Apologies, guys, we'll get this sorted out. So Tracy, can you close the poll?
Let me try again.
Because I can't see a poll here now. Okay, what I'm going to do is...
Sorry, I'm playing it real quick. There we go. Perfect.
Right, sorry, the poll got stuck there for some reason. I don't think we'll do the next poll because it seems to hang. So the vendor management piece, making sure that the vendor management community is trained on the use of AFP is absolutely critical. Otherwise, we're not going to get the benefits from dealing with third-party suppliers. So I'm going to skip this poll because I don't want it to hang again. So I want to go to the next one. So function points by themselves are not enough. We need to balance the seesaw in terms of looking at other metrics. So things like lead time, just picking on that one. Lead time is absolutely, it's a critical metric that we use in the Agile and DevOps world, and we, using lean practices. But to be able to say the average lead time per function point is 8 days, as one of my organizations is, it's really important because it allows that organization to assess across the portfolio and at the team level in terms of where they're improving, where there might be issues. The technical debt one. So going back many years, I did a project where the new Scrum team we put up delivered less than 8% technical debt per function point at a time when one of the legacy teams was nearly 40%, but they were a legacy system. That was really important because it actually helped internally win the argument of pushing down the Scrum vote. Even though the guys didn't want to use function points, in the end they were very pleased because it helped with the business case of adopting Agile and DevOps. So you've got to balance the seesaw so you can start to answer these questions of average lead time per function point, technical debt per function point, number of releases, cost per function point, improvement year on year. Now, actually improvement year on year, I recommend that actually is improvement per quarter. Now, this is an absolute must. So this is, for me, the most important slide. Automated function points in an agile environment must be owned by the team. Now, what I mean by that is if they come in and they are seen as a management tool and used as a management tool, the teams will try and game them again or ignore them. And this doesn't matter whether you're talking about internal teams or with suppliers. It will happen to them just as equally as it can happen to you. So if the teams believe that this metric is theirs, they can embrace it. So I've got one organization that I was dealing with where they have a very simple rule. The automatic function point information is used by the teams internally at retrospectives. They use it to improve. They use it to look at technical debt. If there's an issue that needs management to be involved, they use that data and the team votes to escalate the data to management. So for example, where a release train was seriously under-resourced, the teams and then the whole release train said, we want to release the information against the function points to show you how bad its situation is. Another example is where they had issues in terms of vulnerabilities because the security architects were not available. So they could actually talk about the security size inside the security effort per function point being 20%, 30% more than it should be because of the lack of engagement from the security team. So, pardon me. So, we're now getting up to the 15-minute mark, and I'm going to quickly, at the danger of doing one more poll, I would like people to think about what should CISQ be focusing on in terms of standards, because we are a non-profit organization. This is the tip of the iceberg today that we've talked about. There's a lot more things. In fact, this slide deck was about 120 slides that I cut down. So there's a lot more things we could talk about. But we are guided by you. You know, it's free to become a member of CISQ, and I hope many of you do. So in the last poll, I would like to ask people, what should we be focusing on? Is it the general question of sizing in a world where we're moving away from projects and towards more products? Is it more detail around sizing, around agile and development, so go more for the technical issues? Or is it both? I've got a bit of a clue about which I think it should be, but I'll be very interested to see what you guys say. And then we can do a bit of a Q&A session after this. Okay, the results are coming in. Okay, I think we'll stop there. Not surprising, both. Very interesting, 0 around product world. Now, I find that fascinating because one of the things that came up a lot when I was at Gartner was organizations were moving from projects to products and platforms. And product managers, not product owners, product managers who quite often look after multiple product owners were raising the question that they were being brought into portfolio meetings and being asked about what was the overall size of their product portfolio. And the CFO question, it's quite common that the CFO is asking now the head of product management around productivity and the total cost. I think it does depend on the word product though as well, because if you're dealing in an aerospace defense context, if you're dealing with financials, product is an overloaded word. Okay, hide results. So we've got 10 minutes or so, and I would like to open this up now to questions.
Great. Nice job, Dave. Yeah, great time if you want to enter some questions. And Dave, if you want to pop open the questions box, we got a couple. I was able to address a couple of them. One came in asking about how many different languages does AFP support, you know, the specification itself. I actually had a quick sidebar with Dr. Bill Curtis, the executive director of CISQ. AFP is language independent. You know, as long as you can identify the components, etc., you're not language dependent. The tools running it can absorb, you know, the languages. Let's see. There is a question here, Dave, about how AFP is related to cost.
So one organisation, what they've decided to do, it's actually an organisation in Northern Ireland again. They are using AFP with their Agile and DevOps teams, and the teams are free to use standard story points, which they are still doing. But they've, over a period of 18 months, looked at the number of AFPs delivered from the teams. More importantly, actually, they're looking at the amount of functionality delivered to different business units. And at a portfolio level, they've been able to turn around and say, portfolio, if I look at the, I shall pick on one, it's actually the infrastructure, customer infrastructure and services area, called a telco. They've been able to turn around and say, okay, we've delivered 6,000 function points to that unit in the last year. We've got 9 teams involved. The loaded cost of the teams for that 6,000 function points was X number of pounds. That 6,000 function points and those teams were related to the following business cases. The ROI on those business cases was X. So the portfolio team is not looking at the data in terms of, are the teams productive? They're actually really interested in the cost of the function points, the total amount paid by that portfolio, that business unit, and is that business unit actually focusing on the best ROI, the best capabilities? So I like that scenario because that's not used as a cost measure to beat the teams up. You must be more productive and get your cost down. It's actually used as a measure to answer that really important question. Are we delivering the right functionality to give us the best ROI? So the cost per function point is actually relatively simple to measure and identify, as long as you've got a handle on the standard costs and fixed costs of the individual teams. So what other, we'll pick another one, Tracy?
Yeah, a follow on to that is, how can we use AFP during portfolio budgeting exercises?
So we're on to that question really. If you've got release trains, so for example, if you're doing things like scaled agile framework and you're talking about lean portfolio management, then you're still making a lot of decisions in the dark in terms of what's actually been released. You can look at the features that have been released, you can look at the epics, the business epics, but in terms of the effort associated with that being quantified in a consistent way across agile release trains at the portfolio, that's very, very difficult. Now they've been using some fudges in there, 4 hours coding, 4 hours testing, vice versa, while that equals 1 function point, but that is a fudge. So AFP can be used to make sure those release trains are providing information at the portfolio level and the program level, intermediate, consistently, that we can then start to look at the total cost of that program or portfolio. We could then also add in other costs as well. I mentioned one earlier. If we're moving to a world where it's more product-based, things are longer lived, the portfolio team needs to think about the through life support and total cost of ownership. So they want to be able to say, okay, this quarter we've delivered 2,500 function points at this cost to the organization, but we're maintaining 12,000 function points of previously delivered features. And at the moment, they might say, because of technical debt issues, that cost is too high of maintenance. So that might spawn greater focus on technical debt reduction. And this is especially true with suppliers, because if you're dealing with third parties, you really want to understand what is the cost of the new features delivered and what is the cost of currently maintaining and debt reduction programs.
Mm-hmm. Plenty more questions in the questions box. And I suppose whatever we can't get to, we can always
yeah, if you just pick some more.
Sure. What are the average costs for introducing and maintaining AFP? Might be a tricky one.
So AFP is a standard. So from to looking at the standard costs you nothing. You know, you go to the OMG specification site, you go to the ISO site, then it comes down to the tool vendors. So then it's the cost of implementation of the tool and the continued licensing cost. So I'm going to give you an answer I would give when I was an analyst. It depends. It depends on which vendor you go to, and it also depends on how many teams you build this into. So it could be as low as £30,000, and it could be as much as you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars if you roll it out to every single team, and you look at the subscription cost for the next, say, 3 to 5 years. So I hate giving that answer because it's a bit of a fudge on my part, but it does depend on which supplier you're using and how big the scope of the deployment.
And there's a question about how many products are there that can count function points automatically from code. I know we've been having lots of conversations too with up and coming tools. There. Yeah.
So I mean, Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's 2 or 3 vendors out there at the moment, isn't there? So, I mean, you know, Cast supports it. Who else have we got that supports it? We've got I've made a blank on the company's name now. Help me out, Tracy. Who's the other company that supports AFP? I can't remember what his name is.
Oh, there's in Europe, you mean?
So there's two or three vendors at the moment that support it. So
that support, right? The CISQ automated function points. Yes. But I know, you know, you and I've been chatting with other folks that are taking other approaches. So even beyond, you know, AFP.
So this is actually something that I wanted to mention. There are, as far as I know, 2 vendors or 3 vendors that support it today. Now, bearing in mind, that doesn't sound a lot, but bearing in mind the sizing space is small. When I covered it for Gartner, it was one of the smallest areas to cover. There's only about 5 or 6 major players in there. There's 35 players in my spreadsheet. There's only about 5 or 6 that came up at an enterprise level. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is when I've spoken to organizations, vendors that don't support the CISQ standards, quite often they are supporting an automated approach which is similar. More importantly, in the last 3 months, we've had a lot of conversations with vendors and actually sometimes enterprise end users about what will be the next generation of sizing, automated sizing standards. Now, there is the debate about sizing from code. That's still gonna continue. But there is also a question around if a team is using Raleigh, CA Raleigh version 1, Jira, if they're using standard story points, can that information be collected in a standard way that would allow for automated counting from those epics and story points and strategic themes? So I think the next generation of sizing standards will be shifting left. So I think what we have with the automatic function points from code will continue, and the quality of that standard will progress, and we are getting more vendors backing it. But I think the next generation of interest is now shift left, more towards the backlog itself and automated counting from the backlog. The other thing that's come up in terms of standards is benchmarking. Should we be thinking about a standard that allows for the automatic collection of benchmarking data in a standard way that can be used by all the benchmarking companies that are out there?
Mm-hmm. There's a question here. A vendor is suggesting that they can standardize story points and use them for productivity. Have you ever seen that successfully done?
So this was the paper I wrote 7-10 years ago. If you're a Gartner member, it's still out there. Dave Norton, don't assume success, prove it. And it had a mechanism for normalizing story points. I really do wish I'd never written that research paper. The reason being, it was so gamed by suppliers. So if a supplier is saying to you they have a mechanism for using normalizing story points, I would be more than happy to look at it for you, and I would give you an honest answer. If I think it's as good as what you can get from AFP, I would tell you. Happy to do that free of charge. But I would really like to know what's happening in the teams, because my gut feel is there is pressure on the teams to do certain practices they may not need to do or want to do to be able to normalize those story points. So I would say I am skeptical about that. It's possible, but it's very, very rare.
Thanks, Dave. Perhaps we could sneak in one more here.
Sure.
Is the norm to think of cost as labor only, or to include hardware, software licenses?
So this is an interesting one. This actually got back to my research at Philips. We did something called needs analysis. So we had function points, and then we had needs analysis, and the needs analysis was on the hardware side. Pardon me. So we actually had an algorithm that looked at now bear in mind we were talking about embedded systems. We had an algorithm that we actually had used based on Kokomo, which we adapted, that could tell us the needs for the silicon, the hardware, as it was. Now, I've seen and used function points in a similar way with the infrastructure side with teams. Hasten to add, only where we had good and reliable data. Now, the interesting thing is the correlation between automatic function points in a cyber physical world, IoT world, and the hardware is actually quite good. So if you're using automatic function points and an enterprise perspective, then be able to say how many servers, containers we're going to use, that's going to need a lot of data, and there's going to be a lot of variation there. But if you're using a cyber physical perspective, automatic function points, and you're talking about IoT deployed target environment, the standard deviation on the sizing of that physical hardware is much tighter, so it's actually can be used in that scenario more effectively.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay.
Looks like we're at the top of the hour. I just want to remind everyone that we're going to post the slides and recording to our website, and I'll shoot you an email when those are up so you can access them. Thank you, Dave, and everybody for joining us today. It was great to connect with you all.
Thanks everybody for joining. And as we say, when open source, non-profit, open community, please join, please engage. And if there's any other questions, anything else you'd like to know, please let myself or Tracy know.
Great, thanks.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.